Hi, welcome to Reverb, Episode 2, The Politics of Security. I'm Calvin Pollock.
And I'm Alex Helberg.
How's it going, Alex?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Calvin?
I'm pretty good. Are you feeling secure?
I don't know. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Whenever I have to speak in public or like speak into a microphone, I always get a little insecure. So, I mean, it helps that this week's topic was so, directly focused on the concept, a concept like security. I'm already feeling a lot more confident and a lot more, at home. It's assuaging my fear already. So.
Well, that's good because it's important to derive your strength from demonizing an other. And if you want me to be that other on this episode,
hey man,
just let me know.
That might happen. If you find yourself becoming the target of a lot of my ire, you'll just know that I'm doing that to reinforce my own security.
Yeah, and that it's helping you in the long run.
It is,
and
yeah.
That's what matters.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad that we're on the same page there,
okay,
at least.
Great.
So,
on today's episode, we have an interview with Patricia Dunmire from Kent State University on her writing on the politics of security.
We'll also be hearing from our social media and publicity correspondent Ryan Mitchell, who spoke with attendees at Reverb's launch party on March 1st about their thoughts on the power of language in society and politics, and the kinds of topics they find most frustrating and intriguing.
And I think we wanted to start off here by talking about our own kind of perspective as we, on the one hand, talk to Patty and also do our own readings.
We're talking about politics, folks. We get a little political on this episode.
Yeah, we're going to get political, and we wanted to just, right from the get-go, kind of state our commitments and give justifications for them from a kind of popular academic point of view, which is the point of view of this show. So, for my purposes, a really useful concept for framing how I think about political discourse is critical discourse analysis, which is a discipline in linguistics and rhetoric and communication. And the fundamental point of view of critical discourse analysis is that there are social problems in the world. So starting just right from the get-go, foundationally, there are social problems in the world, and that we as academics have the uniquely privileged ability to investigate those social problems and how they're enacted through public language, through public discourse. And so for me, in this episode, two particular social problems that I'm going to be interested in analyzing with Alex, with Patricia Dunmire, are, number one, the social problem of the U.S. military increasingly proliferating its presence in various countries throughout the world. I view that as a social problem. Mm-hmm. And the second is the increasingly tense and deteriorating relationship between the United States and Russia, two nuclear-armed powers. Not a good thing, in my view.
Yeah.
So what's your take, Alex?
Yeah, I agree in a lot of sense. I think that, you and I, we have a similar politics when it comes to something like intervention, especially as regards military intervention in other places around the world. I agree with it from that standpoint, and I think critical discourse analysis, particularly, we talked a little bit in episode 1 about moving away from this conception of studying rhetoric as just be about like, ooh, let's take a look at who's lying, let's pick apart all these insidious arguments. We were trying to get away from that. Well, we're going right back there. I mean, this is, we're going back to, the study of something where, the communication that has potentially deleterious effects on the world. Right. And we're going to give some specific rationales for why we think that might be here in the episode too. I also think it's important to acknowledge that, coming from more of a rhetorical theory standpoint, the opinion that we're giving voice to here is kind of it's challenging major assumptions that exist across the political spectrum, particularly when it comes to national security. There often seems to be this kind of implicit assumption that intervention is always on the table, and that it's always the number one sort of without regard to any sort of like diplomatic solutions or any other kinds of doing politics on a global scale. direct intervention of one sort or another is often the thing that is jumped to immediately. And this, again, concerns both Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives. But there's also anti or non-interventionists, people who have those kinds of politics that say, well, maybe we should take a step back and investigate these other kinds of other options that are on the table.
And what we're going to see in both our conversation with Patty and our own analyses is that these security discourses, they often do serve to shut down other possibilities.
Precisely.
So,
yep. And that in itself is not good.
Exactly. So it's not just that we're presenting other possibilities, but we're interrogating the ways in which this one possibility that we're routinely, repeatedly shown through popular discourse actually shuts down other possibilities. So,
absolutely.
Without further ado, I guess let's go into our interview with Patty.
So welcome, everybody. Today we're sitting down and talking with Dr. Patricia Dunmire, Patty Dunmire, who is a professor of English at Kent State University, the author of a number of scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as the 2011 book, Projecting the Future Through Political Discourse, The Case of the Bush Doctrine. She's on campus here today to give a talk titled America's Most Precious Resource, Futurity, National Identity, and Foreign Policy. Welcome, Patty. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
So I think we wanted to start off asking you if you could tell us a little bit about your prior work, specifically on national security discourse. Mm-hmm. So what kinds of events, speeches, and situations have you analyzed in the past, and what's drawn you to national security as an area of policy discourse?
Right. Yeah. So I was very interested in some of the news reporting on the Gulf War back in the early 90s, and I looked at media coverage and came up with this idea. So the background of that was I had been out of the country when Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and when I was flying back into the U.S. and came through London, they were searching everything. They took out my cassette tapes and were looking in there, and I was like, what is going on? What's all this security about? And what intrigued me was how I was so unaware that anything had happened, and all of a sudden the country's getting geared up for war. And it's like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'll look at this New York Times and Washington Post, and started looking at the reporting. And it's like, well, this Iraq invasion of Kuwait is a big deal. And it turns out that wasn't really what they were reporting on. They were reporting on a projected event of Iraq invading Saudi Arabia. So I got very interested in, they're talking about the future, and that's not what news is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to tell us what had happened. Mm. It took me a while to realize that I was interested in the discourse about the future. That's where it all started. I've always been interested in politics ever since I was a kid. I was the youngest of 4 children, and I don't think my mom wanted to watch Sesame Street, so we watched the news in the morning when I was at home, and that kind of thing. So yeah, why am I interested in national security? I just think after 9/11, again, 9/11 was another moment where it seemed like the country had been making a certain amount of progress, and particularly like Seattle, 1999 had happened, and you had Turtles and Teamsters together again. You really felt like, okay, the labor movement's moving, and all those kinds of things in the right direction. And then 9/11 happens, and it's like, okay, all bets are off. They're going to start cracking down, and there's going to be, this hyper security. And so there's that, just living in it and having to think about it. I grew up basically in the Cold War, and that had a huge impact. And so I'm interested in going back and looking at that discourse and thinking about, how did they construct this all-encompassing fear? And when you're looking at contemporary issues, it seems to me having a historical perspective is really important.
Absolutely.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. So I've gone back and forth between being interested in the post-Cold War moment, and then also getting back at the beginning of the Cold War and seeing how those two moments talk to each other, get reproduced, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you mentioned Seattle protests and how things sort of generally, like the Overton window, shifted after 9/11. I wonder, how do you think about the connection between national security discourse and the political spectrum writ large? Is that part of what draws you to it? Is kind of how it's a way of seeing or thinking about the political spectrum writ large?
Yeah, I mean, I think national security issues isn't a party issue. I mean,
Right.
they all seem to be saying more or less the same thing.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that there aren't discriminations between maybe how Obama talked about it and how Trump does, that sort of thing. But in terms of the work I've done, there's overarching themes that just keep getting reproduced, that sort of thing. So I think there is this sort of singular voice about, what kind of security, why we need security, all those kinds of things.
But I guess what I'm asking is, do you think there's a sense in which discourses about security also have very important implications for domestic issues like labor?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I suppose in some ways it's about clamping down on resistance, clamping down on criticism of, sort of how the world works and what the country does and those sorts of things. I mean, after 9/11, you weren't supposed to criticize. You were supposed to be patriotic, and we had to come together as one. That's always a trope when we're going to war. In the lead up to the Iraq War, we read the Post-Gazette, and all the editorials were like, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this. The day the bombs dropped, they said, okay, we've got to come together. There's no more time for discussion. And that just seems bizarre to me. So I think there is that impulse to sort of not quash resistance, but constrain resistance, to constrain alternative voices. But those are moments when they're most needed. And I think we may be seeing more now in the age of Trump that we can't be expected to speak with one voice, and that people who maybe hadn't thought about that we need to keep still fighting for progressive issues and that sort of thing. Maybe that complacency is gone now that we've got, the progress, quote unquote progress we've made with Obama, and I put that in quotes for lots of reasons, isn't something that we could just expect was going to continue, that sort of thing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that we're thinking about, as you mentioned, these sort of contemporary events in the context of past events, as history repeating itself, and we're sort of observing these patterns sort of recurring over time. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more specifically about, you mentioned specifically Cold War era and post-Cold War era security discourses. You mentioned in some of your articles that we've read that there was a sort of shift in the ways that the way that the U.S. was conceptualized as a state, as sort of a player on the national stage. Could you talk a little bit more about that shift that you saw emerging in those periods?
Yeah. So what's interesting at the end of World War II is the way the nation's leaders see their role on the global stage. And so in one piece that I wrote, I talked about the change in metaphor. So it had been the case that the country was sort of understood itself for the leaders as the sanctuary of democracy, that this is where people come to and they can live a democratic life. But after World War II and the end of the British Empire and decolonization, there's a shift in the metaphor to a powerhouse, the idea that we are going to exert our influence out in the world, that sort of thing. And so and I'm not saying that we weren't interventionists and expansionists before that, but it seems like an important moment to think about how do we imagine what we're doing, that sort of thing. So, and I think it goes along with this shift of, America as this isolated nation. I mean, one of the things that, the colonists and the founding fathers talked about was like America is a special thing because we're new and we're physically distinct and separate from the European past, and we can stay out of those problems and do our own thing here. And so I think for years in that notion of sanctuary, Thomas Paine referred to America as a sanctuary where people go, et cetera, et cetera. But then, you've got technological changes and time and space are different, and so now, we need to start thinking about what we can do out there and sort of extending, there's actually a term, extending our security perimeter ever more broadly, that sort of thing. So that's a shift. And so now there's talk about, and this is like Clinton era, end of Cold War stuff, about integrating the global environment into sort of not the American system, we wouldn't call it that, but sort of the dominant political economic system.
And we would probably call it the global system.
Right. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Right,
That's
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, and that's the kind of the important, really the compelling part of, or one of the most compelling parts of your work is that it really matters how we frame these things. That the way that we talk about these issues has implications for the ways that these eventually become enacted in policies and strategies for diplomacy or military strategies and things like that. So and to that end, could you also talk a little bit more about some of the things that you analyzed, some of the texts or some of the specific instances of discourse where we could sort of see this change emerging in policy discourse?
Right. I've looked at the National Security Council Resolution 68, which is, along with Kennan's long telegram, one of the key documents that sort of mapped out what Cold War policy was going to be about. And I've looked at that in the context of Henry Luce's the American Century. And what's really, it's great to sort of go into some of these documents, and I think that's partly why I like national security stuff, is you go in it and you sort of don't know what's there, and you're sort of naive, and then all of a sudden you see that they're just saying out straight that we want to control the world. They don't quite say that they want to shape the world in a way that accords with American values. And I remember doing a couple of conference presentations where I was talking about some of this language, and this might have been more Dick Cheney and the neocons. I remember saying one thing in particular, I can't remember what it was, and somebody in the audience gasped. And so it wasn't like you didn't even have to analyze. You just said, that this is what they say.
Just pointing it out is sometimes almost enough.
So anyway, so you read that, and then you read these documents, and they'll say, and in a lot of the analysis of the Cold War is about the policy of containment and how we had to contain the Soviet Union. But there wasn't much talk about the fact that we articulated in those documents this expansionist agenda, that we need to shape the world in a way that suits us, and of course it's talked about in a rhetoric of universal values, and this is good for everybody. That's not talked as imperialism, and then it says and we would do this even if there wasn't a Soviet Union. So then it's like, okay, what's going on here? And so you can see really the use of that evil other as the way to legitimize this expansionist project. So that stuff has been very interesting. And what I'm going to talk about today is this theory called modernization theory, which, I just happened upon. I was in San Francisco and saw a book on the shelf, and it said Mandarins of the Future. And I was like, anything with the future, and I grab it. And I learned about this, this theory about how to develop underdeveloped countries. And that's amazing stuff. It's about helping people and all those, and sharing the benefits of our technology and that sort of thing. But it's really striking stuff. So I've looked at that. I've looked at national security strategy documents are interesting to look at, and I've tied more recent ones back into the post-Cold War era. These moments of change or supposed change, historical ruptures or whatever, where people are like, okay, what comes next? So after World War II, what comes next? After the Cold War, what do we do? And I've looked at Bush and Clinton, both Bush's and Clinton and Obama's national security strategies, again, to think about how do you talk about, part of the issue is continuing a future that's very much in keeping with the present, and so moments of change call into question the status quo, and might be a moment for other ideas, that sort of thing. So it seems to me that a lot of the discourse and frenzy is around, okay, how do we control this? How do we contain this kind of ruptures? So I think those are really interesting sort of discursive moments to look at.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too that you mentioned, especially for something like modernization theory, but I would imagine for a lot of other policy discourse too, it's often couched in a lot of these values that would seem to be sort of universal or universally positive, right? Like we are all about human rights, and we're about helping people, and about again I guess, would you call it a metaphorical idea of an underdeveloped nation, or sort of a framing of a country as being either developed or underdeveloped? It seems like that framing is all about, we're going out and we're helping people. And yet that seems to be that there's not all that's at play there. So I guess what other things in the discourse can we notice that's that might be a little bit less ironically positive, and maybe a little bit more pernicious.
Right. And you were asking earlier about how some of the sort of strategies have changed, and I was just thinking about this yesterday. So it used to be developed, underdeveloped, first world, third world. And I think since the end of the Cold War, maybe a little bit before, there became this notion of zones. A zone of democratic peace and a zone of chronic trouble. And so you don't talk in terms of development, underdeveloped. You talked about these areas, these zones, and which one is going to, again, sort of extend itself into the future. Who's going to migrate, which zone is going to migrate into which other zone, that kind of thing. So I think when you're referring to parts of the world as zones of chronic trouble, that's,
right.
That's pretty amazing discourse. So yeah, in terms of stuff I look at, most of the really awful language is attached to, our enemies.
Right.
That they want to destroy and they want to revert and they are tyrannical and all those kinds of things.
And how do constructions of space and time play into that?
Right.
Play into that threat construction and self-other construction.
Right. So I've been thinking about Fairclough's concept of space-time, and he gets it, there's a legacy to that idea. But when we think about, so construals of space and time aren't natural phenomena. They are socially constructed, they are socially contested, and they are a rhetorical resource for legitimizing ideas about other people and our own policies and our ideas and that sort of thing. And I've been thinking about that in terms of the us-them dynamic. And it seems like a lot of times when we talk about us and them, we identify us and them in terms of behaviors and values and moral dimensions and things like that. But there's also this notion of space and time is important to that. We distance ourselves from others by putting them literally in distant spaces. And so if they're farther away from us, we don't know as much about them. They can be sort of created as, or characterized as being scary, different, all those kinds of things.
Right.
But then there's the temporal part of that, and this is, Said and Michael Shapiro and Fabian talk about time having this signifying function. So it seems to me, so I've got this argument that, the future is this privileged space, and that you can locate different people on different moments on a temporal trajectory. And so one way of othering people is to put them farther back in time or in a different temporal space. And so, and a lot of that's what the development discourse does, and that's what a lot of, I haven't looked at more contemporary discourse on terrorism, but it's a similar kind of thing. These are, these people who are afraid of modernity, want to bring it down, all those kinds of things. And so basically, we can claim the future, and then the idea is that we will give the future to them, that sort of thing. But they're a problem because they're past, and they're a problem because of their pastness, the fact that they are in this zone of chronic trouble where they haven't learned modern ways, that threatens our future. Part of my argument is that, for example, with the Cold War, it wasn't necessarily a physical threat so much as it was a threat about the future and what the future of the post-World War world would be. So.
Welcome to Reverberations, a new on-the-ground segment where I, Ryan Mitchell, go to the streets and ask people their rapid-fire associations to important keywords from each episode. These responses are unrehearsed glimpses into how real people engage with loaded concepts in all their complexities and idiosyncrasies. In this inaugural segment, I asked guests at Reverb's launch party to share their views on the political power of language and explain the ethics of language analysis.
I think language is embedded and a part of every power structure and a semiotic act of meaning making in politics and in every single part of our social relations and institutions. And I think language, as of late, has been mobilized to kind of highlight contradictions of capital and obscure relations of oppression within every single arc of society and institutional apparatus. So, for example, I feel like America as an ideology, as an imperial ideology, mobilizes the language of the free market system, of bootstrap ideology, and basically basically obscures every single social relation and economic relation between classes, between people, between genders and sexualities and race as historical and social categories in this country. And a good example could be anything from like believing in the free market as divorced from those social and historical relations, and our welfare system, our healthcare system, our reproductive rights. Every single part, every intersecting issue of those social and economic relations is obscured by language in its contradictions. But I think we can mobilize language in terms of justice and human rights that should be available for every person regardless of their position in society, which seems pretty straightforward, but I think we've mobilized language to obscure that fact over and over again.
But like as us, we're forced to interpret these claims that scientists make, that other people make, and that can happen in many different ways. And so if we live in a democratic society, people are always going to be making claims, and we're always going to have to be evaluating the truth of those claims in some way or another. And an orientation toward understanding the way that rhetoric is used to make those claims will help us better understand, how information can be used to manipulate us, what kind of claim is more likely to be perceived as true, and what kind of claim maybe is more true. Where I think that there is, I will try not to use too much jargon here, something about speaking the truth that is attractive to people. Like I think human beings, not to necessarily ascribe a teleological function to them, but human beings in general, in their Dasein, in their purest theological form, want to speak their truth to a certain extent, and that truth may not necessarily be universal, or may not necessarily be professed in the same way by everyone, but I think that most humans have a genuine desire to speak that truth. And so even the sophist that is trying to argue two sides of the conversation might still be aiming toward that broader goal, that through deliberation, that through sort of antagonistic deliberation, where you engage with both sides of the argument, that you can come toward or move toward a genuine truth. And I think people have different methods of achieving that, and that we have different, I don't want to say like socially constructed positions through which that happens. You have the professor, you have the priest, you have the journalist, and you have your just average person talking on the street giving their opinion about a political issue. But I think most people strive to achieve some form of genuine relationship with the words that they speak, because speaking is always a form of constructing and reifying your identity.
The different disciplines that exist, especially with engineering, I think that in the sciences we have sort of a interesting phenomenon that every scientific field is getting more and more specialized, and while we maybe in the English department just lump it all into STEM, I think each field sees itself as incredibly unique. So to the point where we can even lump together, civil engineering and mechanical engineering. We have different values. They have different values. They have different ways of meaning making. They have different ways of talking. They have different ways of doing things. So I think we can gain a lot from, the questions at stake here, right? What's the future of many applied scientific fields? If in our language we're reflecting this value of specialization, and that feedback is then making those disciplines more and more specialized, and it just keeps going and going, are we ultimately going to get to a point where we're only talking to each other and no one can understand what we're saying? I think there has to be. A shared vocabulary is a really interesting, it's interesting you said a shared lexicon, because I think a shared vocabulary is really important. It's like when you say that word and then your friend knows that word and they both all the same, like in your schema all the same things are triggered, it brings people together. And so I think that I honestly think part of the impetus is on us in the humanities to better understand, and I'm talking about writing here specifically. So and teaching writing. So if we understand how other people are teaching writing and talking about the strategic decisions that need to be made, and we're not using our own ivory tower vocabulary, we understand what they're saying, and we're able to appeal to that and make parallels and ultimately get a kind of a shared vocabulary. I think that's only a good thing, right? Then we can bridge more common understandings.
You think about the split between literacy and orality. The kind of permanence that comes with literacy is sort of like gone when you're communicating digitally. Like, what's a Twitter feed? How is that supposed to permanently communicate something, whether used politically or socially or whatever? It's this weird kind of temporary communication that's not really binding to anything. I think that we need to renegotiate our kinds of social relationships and kind of reconceptualize what it means to talk to people. Maybe embrace the ephemerality, I think. There are lots of people who are using the kind of non-binding nature of a tweet, for example, for negative purposes, but I think that we can maybe, utilize that for emancipatory things. Think of all of the organizations of people, the movements or whatever, that have been orchestrated very, very loosely, but very, very effectively, via Twitter. Any of the things that have happened recently that I view as kind of progressive victories or good things. No, I think that there's a lot of hope. I think that, like anything, it's technology. I don't think that the technology determines where we're going and what we're going to do. I think that we determine what we're going to do with technology.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned more contemporary discourses of terrorism, and that really raises, one really troubling question that we sort of thought of that we wanted to talk about with you today was this issue of the ways in which national security policy now feels just so removed from the everyday discussion, even awareness, attention of Americans. And I don't think that's necessarily a qualitative difference from the past, but it certainly feels as though a lot is happening that we're not aware of. And what do you make of that in terms of excuse me, these discursive strategies? Do the strategies change in light of that material change? Does national security discourse become less important when the policies are so removed from the attention of everyday Americans? Or do you reject the premise?
I guess, we can maybe give an example of what we were thinking of. Just to, again, contextualize this, we were talking about, there was this whole big kind of fiasco with President Trump recently where he had this phone conversation with a widow whose husband was a U.S. soldier who had died in Niger. And, there was, of course, the whole big splash story about, he said, he knew what he was getting into and everything. But then there was also this other question that started bubbling up, which is, wait, we have troops in Niger? Like, what are we doing there? We have somebody like John Kelly who comes out and gives a statement that says, essentially, I don't have the actual quote up here, but it's something to the extent of we're in lots of places, and we're it's kind of throwing around this talk about we're doing this for the sort of the security of the globe. We're doing it to keep these places stable as well. So he's giving he's using a lot of these strategies that I think that you're pointing out about sort of containing or maintaining a certain level of stability and security, and that it's kind of the U.S.'s responsibility to do that. But at the same time, that wasn't being talked about before this sort of leak of a kind.
And I guess for us as people who we read a lot of public address scholarship about war rhetoric, which tends to kind of assume that you need to unify the public to gain strong public support. And it feels like the rhetoric now is less about garnering public support than about garnering a kind of public acquiescence.
Yeah, when you were asking the question, I was absolutely thinking about the Niger example. And I have a pretty good sense of not literally where we are, but that we are everywhere. But I was stunned when it was 1,000 troops, and like 1,000. You usually hear special forces, a few hundred, a few dozen, whatever.
Right.
So I think it doesn't make national security discourse any less important, because I don't know that the public attends to it anyway. I mean, it'll come up in speeches. You'll see in the national security document that Bush will be using phrasing and that sort of thing. And I don't know how you would ever get the public to pay attention to this stuff. I mean, not that the public couldn't, but there's lots of pressures and all kinds of things.
Right.
So I do think it's important, because I think they're very clear, and this has been going on, for a long time, that we are going to be everywhere, that we are going to be. I think they use the language of like constable, and world police and all that kind of stuff. Right. And so I think looking at that discourse in terms of how they justify it is, I think, always going to be compelling. And I think it may be even more so, because I don't know that, we haven't declared war, since forever. And I just mentioned this to my graduate students, and they had no idea.
Yeah.
Because they were saying, well, wait, if he wants to do anything, then Congress will have to do it. And I'm like, we haven't declared war.
Right.
And they looked at me like I was crazy. So it may not be that, knock on wood, who knows what Trump is doing, but our national security isn't about waging war. It's just about constantly just being everywhere. And it's the stability is this hyper value, right?
Yeah.
Again, that's all about stability, status quo, and of course it's needing stability for financial reasons, those kinds of things. So you have stability by just tamping down, this little eruption here and tamping down the eruption there. And, and it's very Orwellian, it's very science fiction-y, and it's really quite it's just it's pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, and in terms of tamping down these challenges, right? You in your work on futurology, you talk about the ways that futures research, which is this kind of like research area, which is really fascinating. But the futures research tends to assume, again, kind of that powerhouse metaphor, that the West goes out into the rest of the world and futurizes the rest. So the other current case study we wanted to bring up is this issue of the Trump campaign's collusion with Russia. And something that occurred to me reading your work in preparation for this was that is part of what is so hot about this scandal, the idea that in this particular case it feels almost as though the rest violated that assumed power relationship between the West and the rest. The idea that we've been brought into an uncertain future as opposed to having controlled it ourselves.
So meaning with Trump coming in, or
the outcome of the election,
and we're going to do another segment on the show that kind of looks at the language of how people have talked about the Russia scandal, using words such as using language like Russia hacked our election, or that there was sort of an infiltration of Russian influence into this kind of thing, which has this notion that there's been some kind of manipulation, that there's been an invasion of a sort. So it kind of seems to be almost like a little bit of a reversal, or it's counteracting some of the things that you talk about in what our traditional conception of West-East or West-Rest relationships have been, at least discursively, put out there as this is what the future holds. We can even think about this. One of the things that I really like a lot about, I actually wrote down a quote from the article, which is called, I believe it's Knowing and Controlling the Future. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. You write here, the content and implications of futurology is obscured by its discursive structure and linguistic features that help bolster its policy proposals and arguments by rendering future possibility as future inevitability. That is, the rhetorical force of interested and motivated proposals for action is achieved in part by presenting those proposals as necessitated by disinterested, objective future reality. So if we want to think about disinterested, objective future reality. I'm remembering back to, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, were following things like the 538, Nate Silver sort of statistical predictions. The forecasting that had put, Hillary Clinton as, being
having a 98.1% chance of winning.
Which is
you couldn't imagine it any other way.
Right.
You couldn't imagine that it really could have been Trump. I mean,
I think that it really speaks to the extent to which, this kind of future orientation that is often, put forward through this sort of imagined idea of, we have the data so we can know and predict the future. And that was just so undermined by the outcomes of the election itself.
Right. Yeah, and I find myself thinking, as I do, that they're going to bring him down. There's got to be something there. I mean, the Washington Post keeps hammering on this. They're always talking. They know stuff. And it's like, what am I saying? Like they thought he was going to lose the election. So you are all of a sudden like, and I guess part of that is an impulse to believe that things will work out. That this is a horrible thing that happened. He's a horrible person. He works with horrible people. He has horrible ideas. That can't really be legitimate, and so somehow it'll get turned around. And so it's that hope in the future, in a certain sense. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about, like with Trump, and I think that, which on the one hand is really telling, but on the other hand I think is maybe a positive, is this notion of a progress. I mean, I think that we live in a country where typically people think that we just keep progressing. Things always get better, and it's inevitable.
Kind of teleological.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's always better. And so I mentioned earlier, I think there was this liberal complacency that, nope, we are post-racial, and women, rock, and they're considered equal, and we've got, gay rights and all those kinds of things. And so you feel like, okay, finally, and then this happens, and then all of a sudden it just turns around. All of a sudden it's like, no, we have to remind people in the White House that the Civil War and slavery were bad. It's not an honorable thing. And so this notion of progress is just razor thin, and one people's progress is another person's problem. And so again, it's that fight over the future. This is a progressive future for some people, and a progressive moment. Other people say, no, this is leading us down the road to fire and brimstone, that sort of thing. I think the Trump moment has really sort of blown that wide open and said, And so the positive part is that, my older sister, who would never have thought to do this, went to the Women's March in Boston because, oh my gosh, things aren't as secure for me as I thought, those kinds of things. So.
And doesn't Trump also kind of undermine this idea that the West should be futurizing the rest as well? I mean, given that he holds so many, quote unquote, backwards. It's so hard to avoid using the metaphors when you talk about it. But he holds so many ideas that our kind of like dominant discourses about how we interface with the rest of the world assume are no longer in this country anymore.
Well, and that's something I've been struggling with, because I'm very critical of President Obama and President Bush's and President Clinton going out and saying, we are, a model of democracy, and we care about others, and we do these things because we want everybody to have freedom and justice, knowing that that's not why we do what we do. And then when you have an administration that doesn't even want to play that game, they don't want to think about human rights, I'm like, wait a minute. But he should be even though I know that they don't really care, there's something that I have bought into about, at least symbolically, we should present ourselves that way. But although I know it's Hippocratic to do that.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Like, the fact that we're just, dumping that rhetoric at all is just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
But maybe it's more honest this way, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know.
That's something we struggle with.
That
like,
definitely
it's more honest, but think about the kids, What a terrible role model. This guy doesn't even pretend to be a nice person with values.
Whenever I say honest, people will sort of look at me funny and be like, well, he lies all the time. But at the same time, again, I don't necessarily want to use a word like transparent to describe it, but it's more, it's actually, I mean, he's kind of giving up the ghost in a certain way about the way that a lot of these policies have kind of been going for a while. He's just not using the same kind of linguistic forms that that a lot of the discourse that you've studied does implement to at least project that that idea that we're doing that.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, I just don't know how I feel about that, because I don't know. It's an interesting problem. So.
Definitely.
I think we wanted to end just by trying to maybe move in a slightly more positive direction, just considering the potential for positive change. What do you think a positive discourse of the future looks like? Because so much of your work is tracking these ways in which kind of the future gets assumed in discourse, and then the public is implicated in tacitly or overtly accepting that future. And I mean, is it possible to use some of these strategies for good? What do you see as the connection between futures-oriented discourse and positive change?
I think part of it is about, a multiplicity of voices who get to speak about the future. And actually, Bernie Sanders isn't the answer to all our problems, but he is a different voice. And, he doesn't shy away from the S word, and he owns it, and he tries to explain it. I mean, we have a political system that's really constrained and very limited in terms of who can speak and all those kinds of things. But on the ground, there is this thing called critical future studies, and those folks are very much, they came out of sort of the development era and being very critical of Western efforts to, bring them the future, so to speak. Right. I think anybody that can speak about different economic models in terms of how economies can be organized, that sort of thing, I think are important. And I don't think about this much in my work, and I'm no expert, but it just seems like the technology, again, has all kinds of good, positive future potential.
Yes.
However, it gets commercialized, it gets commodified, and all those kinds of things. And so, when I was here all those many years ago, the World Wide Web was a new thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was, oh my gosh, this will be great, all this information, blogs, all those kinds of things. And I don't know, when a technology is that powerful, it tends to get, co-opted. And but it proliferates, and that might be, a way. I mean, it may be the case that it, all the social media stuff is having a positive influence in terms of, getting us voices from Cairo and Tunisia and all kinds of places like that.
Yeah.
But because of that, it also is a threat. So it's always that double-edged thing.
Yeah.
But it's that it, maintaining a sense that the future's contested.
Right.
I mean, that's what I find really inspiring about what you've written, is that, we need to bring back that idea, right? That the future is a space of possibility. Right. Because it really feels like when you talk to people on a daily basis today, no one has a positive view of what's going to happen. Everyone is just dreading the next day.
It's
politically. I mean.
Yeah. In a lot of ways. I mean, I think that that there might be some signs of hope. To contextualize, when we're recording this is just after midterm election, where where progressive people kind of had a major windfall in a lot of sort of key state elections in a lot of different places, Pennsylvania and where we're recording, Pittsburgh included. We need to start, I think, thinking about ways that we can project a different kind of future, or a different, not shy away from making claims about moral visions of the future that we want to see, because, as somebody like, I think it was, Karl Rove had the sort of famous quote about, we're constantly creating new realities, or we might paraphrase, new futures, and while you're, analyzing those realities, we're making new ones.
Yes.
So I think that, that should be a pretty, a clarion call to the fact that, we shouldn't be afraid to start, standing up and at least, making those kinds of claims for a future that we want to see.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. Is getting people to think critically about the future, where it comes from, what can be done about it, multiple voices. See, with the Hillary-Bernie thing. I mean, again, there was. Man, Bernie is freaking the Democrats out.
Oh, yeah.
There's still kinds of things,
Yeah, so, one day it's don't litigate the 2016 primary, and the next day they're going at it and
the next
litigating
day we're publishing the book, What Happened?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but again, it's one of those, it's interesting to think about a moment where discursive construction of a future inevitability that was so, we were so sure was going to happen has been disrupted. I mean, from a political standpoint, like, it's made the climate's so much more toxic and
Right,
everything.
right.
It seems that way.
But also much more interesting.
I mean, I think it's opened up
Right.
the spaces for people to articulate things that, you know, that might not have been, you know, like you said, within the bounds of the Overton window
Right.
before.
Right,
So
right. I mean, my husband is a historian, and so he's used to thinking about change and just sort of different historical moments. And when I would be like, oh, you know, we'll never get rid of the death penalty. That's here forever. There's no way. There's no way.
Right.
He's like, you know, you think people in like 1820s thought slavery was ever going to end? And then it ended.
Yeah.
Right? And it didn't just end, but it ended. And so we get caught up in our worlds where everything seems so certain and power is, you know, vested in particular kinds of ways, and we can't, again, that inability to really imagine what it would take to make things different. And so that's what I sort of think about when I feel that way, and when I hear students talk that way. It's like, well, there was a whole economic system that was completely ingrained and made a lot of people a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the world changed. So I think, you know, I think that idea that it's always contested and contestable is really important.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I think that's a brilliant note to end on. So, again, thank you so much, Dr. Patricia Dunmire, for sitting down with us, Patty. It's been wonderful having you here and talking with you.
Thank you.
Again, we'll link to some of your articles and your work in our show notes.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you.
coming. Tune in next week for the Politics of Security Part 2, when we'll be further developing several of the themes from our conversation with Professor Dunmire through analyses of two distinct artifacts of security discourse.
Our show today was produced and edited by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock. Reverb's web designer is Anna Cook, and our publicity and social media team is Ryan Mitchell and Audrey Strome. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. Thanks for tuning in.